What kind of man was Nabal? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Samuel on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 1 to 13, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Samuel 25, verse 1, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, 1 Samuel chapter 25, beginning at verse 1. Then Samuel died, and the Israelites gathered together and lamented for him, and buried him at his home in Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel, and the man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. The name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. And she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. When David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall say to him who lives in prosperity, Peace be to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them all the while they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David." So when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in the name of David, and waited. Then Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from?" So David's young men turned on their heels and went back, and they came and told him all these words. Then David said to his men, "Every man gird on his sword." So every man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supplies. Chapter 25 takes a break of Saul's pursuit of David, though it certainly fits within the time period because David is still on the run from Saul. Verse 1 tells us that it is at this time that Samuel dies. We don't know how old Samuel was when he dies, but based on the destruction of Shiloh taking place around 1094 BC, when Samuel would have likely been a teenager, and Samuel's death occurring close to the end of Saul's reign in 1010 BC, it is safe to assume that Samuel was approaching 100 if he didn't reach 100. We hadn't seen Samuel since chapter 19 when David fled to Ramah before going on the run, but it is said in 1 Samuel 7:15 that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, even during the reign of King Saul. And so even though Samuel wasn't the face of the nation during Saul's reign, he didn't disappear either. And such is evident because 1 Samuel 25 verse 1 said that the Israelites gathered together to mourn his death. We can assume that this would include David and Saul as well, with Samuel being an important figure in both of their lives. Samuel is buried at his home in Ramah, the place where he spent much of his time as judge, especially in his later years. What kind of a man was Samuel? He was a righteous man. At the beginning of the book, recall his life was devoted to the Lord by Hannah, his mother. And Samuel kept true to that calling through the fall of the house of Eli as priests, through the destruction of Shiloh, the constant harassing by the Philistines, the rise and fall of King Saul in the eyes of the Lord, and through the anointing of David. Samuel was perhaps the greatest prophet in Israel since the days of Moses and Joshua some 400 years before. Sure, Israel had famous heroic judges like Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, but none of those judges united Israel together under God like Samuel did. And even after the days of Samuel, there would only arise a few prophets of God who would rise up to challenge the impact that Samuel had on Israel. Samuel was truly a prophet of God whose faith can be emulated. Now, of course, Samuel wasn't a perfect man, for his children wouldn't grow up to be like him, but to be more like Eli's sons. But that doesn't diminish the faith of Samuel, nor his standing before God. With the death of Samuel, though, we begin the transition from the reign of Saul to the reign of David. It wouldn't be immediate, but it would be soon. After Samuel's funeral, we're told that David went to the wilderness of Paran. Some older manuscripts, like the Septuagint, would say that David went to the wilderness of Maon. The reason for the difference likely has to do with the connection to the next story of this chapter, which has David in Maon. Recall from our study of Numbers that the wilderness of Paran was today in what we would call northwestern Saudi Arabia, not too far from Edom in David's day. If this is the wilderness that is being referred to here, it would seem strange that David would travel this far away and outside of Judah's borders for sure, since God had told David to leave Moab and remain in Judah back in chapter 22. Now, of course, the wilderness of Maon could have also been known as the wilderness of Paran, for which we have no evidence for, with there being thus two wildernesses of Paran. But either way, it makes sense that David returned to the wilderness of Maon based on the story that follows. Does it matter in the grand scheme of things? No. For whatever the case, we can trust the Bible is accurate, but it is helpful in our minds to have an understanding of where we are so that the story makes sense. In Maon there is a rich man named Nabal who did his business in Carmel. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, showing us how rich he was indeed. Nabal's wife was named Abigail, a woman of good understanding and a woman of beautiful appearance. This contrasted heavily with her husband, who was foolish, harsh, and evil in his doings. From the wilderness, David sent 10 of his men to Nabal at the time when Nabal's shearers were shearing the sheep. David's request of Nabal was for food and provisions for the feast day is upon them. Sheep were sheared in the springtime after the winter was over, so perhaps the feast was the feast of Passover, but it could also have been another feast not mentioned in the Old Testament, for the Hebrews did have a festival that they had instituted to celebrate the shearing of the sheep. Whatever the case, David desired that Nabal provide for his men out of his abundance. Now, why would David expect such hospitality from Nabal? Because, as we see from David's testimony and the testimony of Nabal's men later, David actually protected Nabal's shepherds and shearers during their duties, ensuring that Nabal didn't lose any sheep, either at the hand of David or anyone else. So in this, David is not asking for payment per se, but he is asking for hospitality that should have been given by Nabal, considering what David had done for him. But true to his character, Nabal feigned knowing who David was, even though most people in Judah around that area would have known who David was. Nabal didn't feel he had a need to provide for David. In fact, using the excuse that if he helped David, he would be taking from the provisions for his shearers. Nabal is an extremely wealthy man and could have done both, but because of his evil heart, chose not to. When this rejection came back to David by his servant's report, David was angry. So much so that David told his men to gather their swords, for they were going to go punish Nabal. 400 of David's men did so, with the remaining 200 staying back behind, protecting their supplies. The question of whether David was justified in going to punish Nabal, we're going to leave for the next lesson, so we invite you back for that. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 14 to 22, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.